Hi guys, so we are going to be setting up for watercolors. Your containers for your watercolor sets should look like this with your table number on them, and they are on the back table by the windows. Inside there you will see our watercolor setup and cleanup paper for helpful reminders. So once we get our box with all of our supplies, we are going to fill up our water containers. So you have your paintbrushes in a little cup like this. You're going to take them out, fill this cup about halfway with water. Take my brushes out, they can just lay on the table. Your droppers you should find can go into that clean cup of water. We do not rinse our brushes off in this cup of water. This is only for clean water because you need water to make watercolor paint. You have another contraption here with a basin and a top piece for our dirty brushes. So this is going to get filled up with water. You pull this out, twist it off, fill it up, and then when you come back to your table, you do need to be a little bit careful about pouring this right over this spot, and then it should fill up with water just in this bottom portion. You should have a little blue button that you can push to dump out dirty water. There's a few missing, so you may actually have to take the end of a paintbrush and just push down to get rid of that dirty water as you're working. And it lets clean water keep flowing in. I'm going to put this off to the side. And then I'm going to need my palette. Your name should be on that lid and on the back. I'm going to open this up and get this ready to go. And then my paint sets. So I'm going to take out one of my paint sets, and I also need some paper towels. Okay, so I am set up. The next thing I'm going to do is with my dropper, I'm going to wet any of the colors that I want. And for this practice worksheet, I need primary colors mostly. So I'm going to just wet my yellow, my red, and my blue. And I'm just putting some water in with that dropper. I can also use the dropper to put water into my palette so that I'm kind of making a little bit more paint that way without just scooping it from my paint set. The more water you add, the lighter the value. The less water you have and directly from the paint tray, the darker the value of the color will be. So we do need different amounts of water to create different values, is one way we can create them. And then we want to make sure our brush is clean. Don't trust the last person to have done this correctly. So I'm going to go ahead and swipe it in my dirty water container here. There's little ridges there that you can wipe the brush back and forth on, and then dry it off just a pinch to make sure that it is clean. There's no paint left in my brush. Then I'm going to go ahead and get started here. So you can put on a smock if you like. You need your paper towel, your water containers are filled up, and we've wet the paint with the dropper. I'm going to create a wash first. A wash is a color with no change in the value, so the whole thing looks nice and smooth and even. This is perfect for painting backgrounds, good for filling in large areas, the sky, the ground, things like that that you are painting. So the first one says to use first red and then yellow on top, then blue first, orange on top, blue first, red on top. So I am going to need some orange paint here. I'm going to go ahead and wet my orange as well. And I'm going to start and mix up my red. So I'm touching my brush to the paint and kind of mixing that water in there to make some paint. And then I'm going to use my brush to kind of pick up that paint. It's pretty drippy. I'm not wiping it off. And what I'm going to do is actually wipe it into one of the holes where I put some water. And I'm just touching my brush to the side of that hole in the palette to get that paint to come out of my brush into the palette hole. Okay, again, more paint from the tray is a darker value, but I already have some water in there, so I think I'll be pretty good with that. So what I'm going to do here is paint in this box with some red. I'm going to dip my brush, and then I'm also going to wipe it just 1 or 2 times before I start to paint. I don't want my brush to have too much paint in it because I just make a flooded mess. I need to control that amount of water. And then what I'm going to do is simply paint in this whole box, start at one end, and I'm kind of working side to side, pulling this color down. And if I need to get more color, I can easily go back to my paint tray and pick up more color because the value is going to be the same. Okay, so this is pretty much a flat wash. If I pick up my paint from my paint tray, my value will be different than what I have in here, which is why we need to use the palette. Every time you pick up from the paint tray, it ends up having less and less water, which means the color is going to be darker. So if I picked up from here, you'll see if I continued, look how dark that is. I would not be able to match the same value. So that's why we need to use the palette. I'm going to go ahead and paint in my blue on both of these 2 boxes, and then I'm going to let this dry and move on to some of my other areas. So I've got number 1 right here, and it looks like I skipped number 2, guys, so this number 3 is my next one right here. I'm going to go ahead and take a look at what I need to do. We're making values, the lightness or darkness of a color. So mix up a light value in your palette. Well, we already have that with our red, so I can stay with this light value. I might add a little bit more water to it to make sure it's pretty light, but I know it looks like this. So I can add a little bit more value to get it a little bit lighter. Stir that up. Okay. And then I'm going to go ahead and paint over all of the boxes with this value. So I'm going to go across all of my boxes, that one value. Now this paper dries pretty quickly. It's not watercolor paper, it's a thicker paper, but when we're working with watercolor paper, it's a little slower to dry. So we need to make sure sometimes that things are dry before we paint over them again, which is what these 2 are requiring. However, on our worksheets, they're going to dry pretty fast. So my next one is a wet on wet painting over here. And that means that I am painting wet paint on a paper that's already wet. This says to get 2 primary colors ready. And then I'm going to paint the box with 1 and put dots of the second color on top while it's still wet. You have to do this very quickly because, again, this paper dries very quickly. So I'm going to go ahead and rinse my brush. Again, don't use your good water to rinse your brush off. You're only using this container to wash my brush. So I'm going to go ahead and get that red paint out of my brush and mix up my second color here. You guys should have that second color already made from doing the boxes up top. So I'm going to take my blue, stir that around, pick up some of that paint, put that into the palette hole where I already have some water. You can see now I'm making a lot more blue paint that way. I'm going to test it out and just see my value. I think that looks pretty good. And it says to work very quickly here, and I'm going to take one color, paint it down, and then I'll put the other color right on top. So I'm going to go ahead and I think I'll start with blue since I already have that on my brush, and I'm going to have to switch very quickly to the red. For the red, I really want to see this strong contrast. I'm going to use the red right from my paint set just to be able to show you a little bit better. So I want this to be really wet. I'm not wiping my brush this time. I'm going to keep all that water in there and kind of spread that around as best I can. It doesn't need to be a flat wash. I'm trying to keep this really, really wet. So I want a lot of my water on there. Rinse my brush off real quickly, pick up my red, and get some drops of other color where it's still wet. I know it's not going to be wet everywhere. So you can see the difference there where my paint was still wet and what happened, and what happens if my paint is dry and I paint on top. This is damp, so we'll still get a little bit of the effect, but you can see the difference there. Okay, I'm going to come back over here to intensity. The intensity of a color means that it's either really intense or it's dull or neutralized. And we can get this effect by mixing complementary colors. Since I already have blue in my palette, I'm going to go ahead and make my orange because I'm going to need that later when I come back to this one. So my brush has been cleaned off. I can double check it. I'm going to mix up some of my orange. I'm going to add a little bit of water to my palette. And I'm going to put that orange into that water right there. Okay, so I'm going to be working with orange and blue as my opposite or complementary colors. And it says to put the complementary colors in 2 different spots in my paint palette. I've done that. And then I'm going to put just one color into this first box. So I'm going to go ahead and paint in this first box. This is a good trial run of getting painting in the lines, especially for some smaller areas. I always like to have my hand rested so you can kind of see my pinky is rested there on the tabletop to give my hand some stability. Now this one says to have more of my first color in it, but I'm going to mix just a tiny drop of blue into my orange before I start this. So I got to rinse my brush. Then I will pick up just a tiny bit of my blue, very tiny bit, and I'm going to mix that into all of my orange here. And you can see what it's done is it's kind of made that orange a little brownish. I'm going to paint that next. Okay. Rinse my brush. Now the next thing is going to be mixing some of my orange into my blue, but I need to paint that blue first. So I'm going to paint my second color, is my blue over here. Okay. And then it says to go ahead and add some of my orange into my blue. I'm going to pick up some of this orange and mix that into my blue. Whoa, that made the blue dark. And you can see it still looks blue, but it's just a darker value. It's not as bright and intense. This is also still looks orange, but it's not as bright and intense as this orange is. And then for my middle box, it's going to be an equal mix. So I'm going to take a bunch of my blue here and mix it into my orange until I think it's probably an equal amount. I might even need to use it all. So I'm soaking up this blue and I am wiping it off into my orange and give that good mix. And then I'm going to paint that right in the middle. And you can see that made actually a pretty good brown. Okay, and my last technique is going to be dry brush. Go ahead and pause your video when you need to finish out what you're doing and then come on back to me when you're ready. So for dry brush, what we want to do, we do need to start with a wet brush. So I've been using this paintbrush, so it is nice and wet. But I'm going to dry it off some. I don't want it to be too wet. And then what I'm going to do is separate these bristles. I'm fanning them out as much as I can. These kind of golden brushes are a little bit harder to do this with. The softer brushes that are brown like this are actually a little bit easier. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to this brush to show you this technique. It also works really well with what's called a fan brush. We only have a few of these brushes left. If you happen to have one, this is already fanned out. So this is kind of what we're attempting to do with this paintbrush. So I'm going to go ahead and wet my brush here. Dry it. And then I'm going to separate these bristles out. Get it into a fan, and you see this brush stays a little bit more when I fan it out. Okay, again, I want to make sure it's pretty dry, so I'm testing it out. A little too wet. And then I'm going to take just the tips of my brushes and dip them into one of my paint colors. I'm going to do blue, I think. And I just want to dip the very, very points of those brushes, not the whole brush. I'll give it a quick test to make sure it's not too wet on my paper towel. And then what I'm going to do is just make some lines. So this is a good way to get some texture, okay? So you can see the texture that's there. This is great for getting grass texture. It's great for flower petals that might have multiple colors. This can actually be done on top of something else. I'll show you real quick over here what that looks like when I build my colors up, okay? So we're not done yet. Remember, we did these tap ones that we were waiting for them to dry. So we're going to go back up to these tap ones here, rinse my brush one more time, Okay, make sure it's pretty clean. And then this says red first, yellow on top. So I had wet my yellow before. My yellow is looking a little greenish. We're going to see if we can clean that up just a pinch. So I'm going to take some of that color off the top. You can do this with a sponge when the paints are dry. That's a little bit better. Okay, we're pretty good there. We're pretty cleaned up, I think. Most of the green is gone. Okay, so now it says to go ahead and mix up some of my yellow for that top layer. Brush is getting a little dirty. I'm going to drain this out, get some clean water in my container. There we go. Okay, picking up my yellow, putting that in my palette. And then I'm going to paint this over my red that was here. So I'm doing another wash right on top. And we're going to look at how that color has changed. So even though I did my red first, now I have my yellow on top, I can kind of see both colors. Watercolors are translucent, so I can get a really good idea of what my colors over top of each other might look like. And again, when we go back with details and things, that's when we might want to use the paints right from the paint set to get some of that really darker value. As you can see when I did my work down here, that was right from the paint set, and that red is really intense. Okay, so good luck, guys. Let me know if you need any help with this. And then we're going to go ahead and start our paint cleanup. So when you're ready for paint cleanup, when you're done this worksheet, hit play again on this video so you can go through a couple things with me. Okay, so we're ready to clean up. I'm taking my brushes and I am going to just rinse them off in my dirty water here. And then once everybody is done, we're also going to give a final rinse in our clean cup of water. But these should be cleaned basically before we do this. Okay, rinse that off. And then I'm drying all of my brushes on my paper towel. We're not putting away wet brushes. Okay, we're reshaping the hairdos as we do that. Okay. When you put your work into the drying rack, an important step is to make sure that you don't have any puddles on your work. You really shouldn't be working with that much water anyway, but if you do have a buildup of puddles, you want to use what's called thirsty brush and just kind of go into any puddles and let your brush kind of soak it up. Your brush should be dry. Soak up any puddles with that brush, let it absorb, and then wipe them away before you put your painting into the drying rack. Make sure that the drying rack you're putting it on is laying flat. Those shelves do move. You want it to be flat so none of your paint spills down the side of whatever you're working on. Okay, washing out each brush and then just set them on the table. You're going to have to go dump out all your water containers. So we got to dump this out. We're going to take this tap off and dump this out. But now all of my water has actually drained into this basin. So I've got to go to the sink, open up this lid, and go ahead and get rid of that water that's in this bottom basin. Okay, so drain this out, and then I'm going to take this lid off. It just pops off. It's not a twist or anything. You can twist it a little bit if it's stuck, but make sure you're doing this over the sink. Any colors that we might have gotten mixed together, like how my yellow here had a little bit of green, what we would do is just take a sponge and get out any mixture of colors. Okay, we're going to leave the paint sets open in here. You can see they should be kind of stacked up every other one. So this one is here. I'm going to put this one where the paints are on this side so that they can dry a little bit. We don't want to have them be sopping wet. Your paint trays, if you want to save them, your lid can just go on, but you need to be very careful that you're keeping it completely flat when you put this away. If you don't need it, we can do a quick wash at the sink. Just a little bit of water, sponge through there, and then dry off your palette before you put it away. And then we're going to go ahead and wipe off our tabletops. Anywhere we got paint, just a wet paper towel, come back and wipe everything down. All your brushes will go back into the cup, brush and up in the cup. Okay.